Uka Uka is free. No, it cannot be. Evil, great evil has come.
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. First of all, I want to apologise for the lack of overall activity on the channel lately. I've been very busy in my personal life lately, and I've had a lot going on. I started a new job recently and that's taken up a lot of my time. I've also been dedicating a lot of my spare time to training, since I want to keep that up and avoid falling into bad habits. As some of you already know, I also quite recently ran into some hardware issues, which caused me to lose a lot of data, and a lot of the projects I'd been working on for the channel either had to be scrapped or postponed. So yeah, it's been a pretty hectic time for me lately and I haven't really had the time to dedicate to the channel. Thankfully though, I have been working on a few pretty large projects when I can find the time, and slowly but surely I plan to get back on track with some regular content for the channel. As you can tell by the title, today I'm going to be doing something which is quite rare for the channel. I'm going to be looking at 3 separate games, and giving them all a thorough, in-depth retrospective. As you can imagine, this is probably going to be a long ass video, and it's one that I've wanted to make for a very long time. Before I go any further, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button, since it really helps me, and be sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. So long-time subscribers of mine will know that I have a huge passion for PS1 platformers, particularly 90s platformers. As I've talked about many times in the past, I grew up with these types of games, and to this very day platformers are still my personal favourite genre of game. In the past I've made no secret of the fact that my personal favourite series of games is Spyro the Dragon. In fact, as those of you who saw my top 100 favourite video games list that I made a while back will know, link in description for anybody who hasn't seen it. All 3 of the original Spyro games made it into my top 10, with Spyro 3 being my personal favourite game of all time. I also reviewed each of the Spyro games individually some time ago, again link in description. With all that in mind, it would be logical to assume that Spyro would have been my initial introduction to the genre. I mean, with all those games making it into my top 10, you would naturally think that nostalgia had a lot to do with it. And I suppose that's true to an extent, but as I've talked about several times in the past, nostalgia is something that I'm able to overlook when I review games, since I like to think I'm a reasonably rational person, capable of being objective when I need to be. I can perfectly justify why I personally believe that the Spyro games are the greatest platformers ever made, and can do a fair comparison between them and other platformers from the era. With all that in mind, it might actually surprise you to learn that that isn't the case at all, and Spyro wasn't my introduction to the genre, nor was it the first game I ever played or anything like that. In fact, the first video game I actually remember playing, and I'm pretty certain it was the first, was the original Crash Bandicoot from 1996. And this was the game that made a very young me want a PS1 in the first place. I want to make it clear though, Crash wasn't the first game I owned. I believe that was actually Rayman. That's certainly the first game I remember owning. But Crash was the first one I played, and for that reason it's quite possibly the game that made me a gamer in the first place. And despite not covering the Crash games on the channel before, I am actually a huge fan of the series, although I do personally believe that there are other platformers from the era that were better than Crash, namely Spyro, which in my opinion just took the genre to a whole new level. I have to concede that the Crash games were certainly more influential, being more popular and successful than any other PS1 mascot. However, despite being a huge fan of the series, it was always one that I had mixed feelings on, and I'd say that as great as the series was, it was never the most consistent in terms of quality. For this particular video, I want to focus specifically on the original trilogy for the PS1. I played through all 3 games recently, and I wanted to look at each of them individually and break them down bit by bit, as well as comparing them to each other, as well as some of their competitors from the era. Just so you guys know, I will be playing and reviewing some of the sequels and spin-off games in the series. I do own most of the Crash games, and will be making more videos. But again, like I said before, for this particular video I want to focus on the originals. I was actually considering reviewing the Insane Trilogy from 2017, which was the HD remake of the original 3 Crash games, but I figured it would be more in the spirit of this channel to first take a look at the originals, since I am a retro gaming channel after all. But I will be reviewing the Insane Trilogy at some point in the future. So yeah, without further ado, let's look at the most influential, and depending on who you ask, most highly regarded PS1 platformer series of all time, the Crash Bandicoot Trilogy. Starting of course with the first game, simply named Crash Bandicoot, released in 1996, developed by Naughty Dog.
There he is. Moron! This Bandicoot will be my general, and he will lead my Cortex commandos to world domination. This time I shall reign triumphant. We are closer than ever before. Quickly, into the vortex. Dr. Cortex, the vortex is not ready. We have no idea what it could do.
Yeah, this was back when Naughty Dog used to make actual games and not interactive movies, but I digress. As I mentioned before, this was my own introduction into gaming. I was so blown away by it as a kid that it made me want a PS1 of my own, and for some reason my parents got me Rayman instead of Crash. A game which bent me over backwards and violated me time and time again. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Rayman is one of the hardest, if not the hardest games ever made. And I have an abusive relationship with it. It's a game I love, mostly based on nostalgia, with it being the first game I own, but it just doesn't love me back. It's way too hard for some reason, and I always go back to it. Again, I reviewed Rayman, so I'll leave a link in the description section if you want to check that out, but I digress. The reason I bring up the original Rayman so much in this video is because there were several concepts from that game that clearly inspired several aspects of the Crash trilogy, more on that later. The story of the game, like most PS1 platformers, is a relatively simple one. In a pretty bizarre circumstance, it's very easy to miss the game's story entirely, since it's introduced via a cutscene. However, this cutscene only plays if you sit and wait in the game's menu, rather than starting a new game. For years I didn't actually know this game had a cutscene in the beginning. I first found out about it online. You play as Crash, a genetically enhanced bandicoot, created by the evil mad scientist Dr. Neo Cortex, and his sidekick Dr. Nitrous Brio. Crash escapes and must traverse a whole bunch of levels to thwart Cortex's plans for world domination, and also save his girlfriend Torna, who is a bandicoot of course. That's about as far as the story goes. As I mentioned before, it's very simple, and if you're like me and you missed the game's intro when you first played it, then you'll have no idea what's going on. Not that it really matters, since again this is a game and not an interactive movie. What matters is the gameplay. So how is it? So the game is of course a third-person action-adventure platformer. Playing the game again in retrospect, I can confidently say that it's pretty good. And it started a trend and an overall gameplay formula that many platformers would attempt to emulate and refine for years to come. But I do have to concede that the game has many flaws, and is a bit rough around the edges, which is to be expected for a first attempt. The game is basically split up into 2 modes. You start off on a 3D island map which consists of a whole bunch of levels. There are 3 separate maps in the game and these can be unlocked one at a time. You can tell that Argonaut, the developers of Croc Legend of the Gobbos, probably played this game. You of course unlock each level by completing the previous one. As far as the levels themselves go, these are linear in nature. You basically traverse each level, defeating enemies, dodging and avoiding hazards and obstacles in the environment, and attempting to reach the portal at the end which unlocks the next level. The vast majority of the levels are designed with Crash facing forward, and the camera trailing behind him. These levels are generally quite slow paced. You move forward, assessing your situation along the way, and you see the majority of the hazards and obstacles as well as enemies in front of you as you approach them, and you will have to figure out a way to progress without dying. What you'll notice immediately is that the game is quite intellectually stimulating. Many of the hazards and obstacles require a serious amount of thought and creativity to avoid, and there's quite a bit of trial and error. This does present some problems though, more on that later. The game does have a surprising amount of enemy variety. Like a lot of 90s platformers, the enemies will have a set path, and will act as more of an obstacle than an actual enemy. Basically, don't let them touch you or you die. You can avoid this by simply avoiding enemies altogether, or by taking them out. Yeah, this game has combat, but it's very simplistic. By pressing either square or circle, Crash can spin, and this allows you to take out most enemies in one hit. In addition to this, some enemies can be jumped on, which can also take them out in one hit, though some enemies are immune to both, and you will have to simply avoid them. Crash himself also only has one hit point, so one hit and you're dead. Like a lot of games from the time, you will have extra lives that can be accumulated as you play. You accumulate lives by collecting Wumpa fruits scattered throughout the levels. As a kid, I always used to think these were apples, but yeah, apparently they're called Wumpa fruits, but I digress. Once you collect 100 of these, you will gain an extra life. You can also find extra lives hidden throughout levels, either in boxes or secret areas. Though just like in Rayman, these are usually used to bait you into a trap, so proceed with caution. The boxes serve as the game's main collectible. As you break them open, they will usually have something useful to offer, such as Wumpa fruits, extra lives, as well as other curiosities. One of the most useful items you can find is the Aku Aku mask. Aku Aku serves a similar function as Sparks in the Spyro games. He flies close behind you and gives you an extra hit point. By collecting 2 Aku Aku pickups, you will get an upgraded version which will give you 2 extra hit points. By collecting 3, you will gain the ability to wear Aku Aku on your face, which will make Crash temporarily invincible. In this mode you can basically run through enemies and hazards, destroying everything in your path.
What have I got?
This is very liberating for obvious reasons, and be sure to take advantage of it when you can. It's interesting because in the sequels, Aku Aku played a more predominant role in the story, and was kind of a mentor and a guide to Crash, but in this game he basically serves his gameplay purpose. Of course, this won't help you at all with the game's platforming. In fact, in some cases it can even be a hindrance, since you may need to land on, or bounce on a certain box, or explosive to progress through the level, and destroying these prematurely can cause you to fail. Oh yeah, did I mention this game has explosives? A lot of them. The explosives are one of the main hazard types in the game. You have TNTs which will activate if you jump on them, giving you 3 seconds to get out of the way before they explode. For obvious reasons, you want to be careful with these. These are expertly implemented into both the level design and the combat, as well as the platforming. You can trap certain enemies using these TNTs. Certain platforming sections of the game will require you to use them, and you will sometimes need to clear them in order to obtain certain boxes. There are also nitros which will explode immediately on impact, so keep your distance and don't try to spin them. There are also solid metal boxes that can be used to make new boxes appear. Again, these are sometimes necessary for certain platforming sections, in addition to containing useful items, assisting with platforming and serving as collectibles. The boxes also serve another function. When completing levels, you will sometimes be presented with how many boxes you were able to break, as opposed to how many you missed. If you want to 100% the game, then you will have to collect every single box in every single level. More on that later. Lastly, the boxes also contain bonus pickups. Find 3 of these in a matching set, and the game will transport you to a secret bonus level. The bonus levels will be in a 2D format, and will contain a whole bunch of boxes for you to collect, as well as some tricky platforming puzzles. In another odd feature, you will actually need to enter these bonus levels in order to save the game. Yeah, just like in Rayman, the way that this game tracks your progress is flat out cruel. If you enter a bonus level and fail to reach the end, you won't be able to save your game again until you find another bonus level. This is, for obvious reasons, a pain in the ass. It's something that I could see making a lot of players want to rage quit, since losing your progress is never a good thing in a video game, but I digress. There are also boxes that bounce you up to high areas in the game. This helps you to obtain certain collectibles and reach platforms that would otherwise be inaccessible. There are several platforming sections where you will have to scale a large building, and of course these are sometimes necessary to progress in these areas. Speaking of platforming, this is one of the most important aspects of a platformer, since it accounts for the majority of the levels. I'd say the platforming is this game's main challenge. And trust me, challenge is the right word. Some levels will have simple, ground-based platforming where you will have to avoid death pits, as well as spike traps and things of that nature. Other levels will have you basically navigating a series of bridges or floating platforms to avoid falling. These get harder and harder as the game goes on. You will often have to perform precision jumps in succession, and for obvious reasons this will include plenty of trial and error. One level about midway through the game, called Road to Nowhere, is notorious for making players rage quit, and I can see why for sure. Though there are a couple of ways to exploit it, such as standing on the ropes of the bridge, though the level is still very hard even when doing this. There are also levels where you have to traverse across streams of water, avoiding man-eating plants and things of that nature. Trust me, it's much more difficult than it looks. The level design of the game is surprisingly varied, and it will often throw you a pretty major curveball with how you will need to approach platforming. For example, as I mentioned before, most of the levels will have Crash facing forward, with the camera trailing behind him. The first few levels are consistent with this, and it gets you used to that formula. However, some levels actually take a bit of time to get used to the controls in these levels. There are even levels that require you to have near inhuman reflexes, throwing out the slow-paced, strategic, cautious gameplay of the regular levels, instead being flat-out hectic. For example, there are levels where Crash will have to run away from a giant boulder, like Indiana Jones. These levels are a pain in the ass, since in addition to being chased by boulders, the camera view also changes, with Crash now facing the screen, and the camera being positioned in front of him. In these levels you will have to run fast and avoid getting squished, and as you run forward, you will have to navigate the level and avoid many traps, hazards, enemies and obstacles, as well as many death pits. And what's awful about this is you can't see anything, so things come at you so fast that you have pretty much no time to react, making it almost impossible to do without a serious amount of trial and error. Be sure to replay the early levels to accumulate extra lives for these levels in particular. There's also levels where you ride on a warthog and will run extremely fast through the level, again requiring you to have near inhuman reflexes to get through in one go. Those levels are pretty fun though, despite the challenge. Every now and then the game throws you a unique and quirky level like this, and it helps to keep the game feeling fresh throughout. What I love about the game is its overall style and atmosphere, as well as the overall quirky tone, the visual aesthetic of the game's levels, as well as the character models and enemy designs, are really impressive for 1996. And the game looks way ahead of its time. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the controls, again more on that later. I also love the game's over-the-top and bombastic soundtrack, it's really awesome. The game also has several boss battles, and these are okay I guess. They're about as good as most boss battles from the time, at least as far as platformers are concerned. They're the kind of bosses that seem challenging at first, but once you figure out the patterns, they're manageable. I won't say they're necessarily easy, since sometimes the hitboxes for their attacks aren't always clear. But as long as you have plenty of extra lives and the will to persist, you should be able to do them. You take on Cortex's henchmen, many of which become legendary villains of the series. Villains such as Papu Papu, Ripper Roo, Koala Kong, Pinstripe, Dr. Nitrous Brio, and of course Cortex himself. The Cortex boss is a pain in the ass by the way. The rest are easy enough once you manage to figure out and memorize the patterns. So that pretty much sums up what the game has to offer in terms of its overall features. Now I want to get onto some of my criticisms, because despite my nostalgia for the game, and despite it being way ahead of its time in some ways, and of course despite it being widely influential, and paving the way for not only the rest of the Crash series, but several aspects of the platformer genre in general, this is a game that I do have mixed feelings on, and I have to admit there are certain things about it that did not age well. First of all, this game has the same problem that Rayman has, only to a much lesser extent. This game is difficult. Now, I know what you're thinking, it's an old school, retro, hardcore platformer, it's supposed to be difficult, and I agree, I'm a veteran of these types of games, and I can tolerate most of them. Hey, if I can tolerate Rayman, I can tolerate just about any game. But as I mentioned before, the game is a bit rough around the edges. And in my opinion, a few technical issues in regards to the game's controls make it way harder than it was supposed to be. What I do have to take into consideration, and those of you who were growing up gaming in the 90s like me will likely know this, back then game developers used to make games extremely difficult for one particular reason. People would often rent games rather than buy them, since it was a cheaper way to do so, and developers realised that in order to prevent people from just renting games and completing them over a weekend, they would need to increase the difficulty to make it so that players would be more inclined to buy the game in order to give themselves more time to complete it. It's definitely possible that this was the case with Crash, but what I noticed from playing through the game again all these years later is that quite often I would simply die due to issues with the controls and technicalities rather than genuine mistakes. I mentioned before how certain levels of the game will require almost inhuman reflexes to complete, and some of them are literally impossible to finish unscathed, unless you have the entire thing fully memorized. This is of course supposed to be hard, and the difficulty does increase over time, as it should. I have no problem with that, but the problem is that the game's jumping controls are often inconsistent. The game doesn't support analog control, meaning you will have to rely on the directional buttons for jumping and movement. The idea is that you press jump and hold down the directional button to control distance, but sometimes these controls felt unresponsive, and Crash would either go further than he was supposed to, or not far enough, leading to many unfair cheat deaths. What makes this even worse is that the game also has the same problem as games like Rayman, and to a lesser extent Duke Nukem Manhattan Project, another game that had this problem. And that is that the hitboxes for certain hazards, enemies and obstacles were not always clear. I swear I would die from enemies that were barely anywhere near me. There are platforming sections that require you to jump and avoid enemies at the same time, and sometimes you will even need to spin an enemy and land simultaneously. The problem with this is that spinning while jumping will sometimes continue to move you forward, even after you land. Again, this causes so many unfair failures. You combine this with the fact that levels will sometimes change the camera angle and the controls remain the same, and the game just feels so much harder than it should be. Again, I'm fine with games being hard, but the difficulty in this game a lot of the time just felt unfair, and as a result of technical issues and lack of optimization, rather than a genuine challenge set by the developers. Still, I was able to deal with this, and again, it's nowhere near as bad as Rayman in terms of unfair difficulty. I mean, I'm pretty sure that game wasn't even playtested. On the subject of the game's difficulty, I mentioned that in order to 100% the game, you will have to obtain all the boxes. How this works is that breaking every box in a particular level will reward you with a clear gem. You can return to each island to see which levels you've obtained gems on, and if you want to, you can replay the levels that you haven't got a gem in order to collect them. Some of these will actually be unobtainable in a first playthrough, since there are several secret areas in the game that can only be accessed by acquiring a particular coloured gem. The coloured gems are obtained by completing a specific challenge in specific levels perfectly. And yeah, these are a pain in the ass to get, but not impossible, just very, very difficult. Once you've collected a coloured gem, you can return to old levels, and there will be a gem of that colour that you can use. These can take you to secret areas, many of which contain extra lives, which are of course very useful. And they will also contain boxes that are necessary for obtaining that level's clear gem. There are also other secret unlockable gem routes in certain levels that will serve a similar function as the coloured gems. You might be wondering what function the clear gems serve. Basically, right before the last level, you get a short level called Great Hall. Here you will notice a bridge made of clear gems. Basically, each gem you collect from the levels will be added to this bridge, and if you're able to backtrack through the entire game and collect them all, trust me, this is easier said than done, you will unlock a bridge to a secret exit in the level, which will unlock the game's alternative ending, which is pretty funny. Though it skips the game's final boss if you do this, which to me is quite unusual. This is a cool feature and all, but is it worth all the time and effort to collect all the gems? Me personally, I don't think so. But I suppose it depends on how much time and effort you're willing to spend on the game. It's up to you. So yeah, that's the original Crash Bandicoot for the PS1. It's a pretty legendary and influential platformer that, in some ways, was ahead of its time. And despite being a bit rough around the edges here and there, it did its job well enough and kicked off a legendary franchise in the genre. As far as my overall score, I think given my criticisms and taking them into consideration with what the game does offer, I give the game a generous 7 out of 10. A very good yet very flawed first attempt.
Failure again! Capture him!
Uh-oh.
Prepare the female bandicoot.
So the following year, after the experience of creating the first game, Naughty Dog had a chance to continue the franchise and hopefully improve and expand upon what was done in the first game. So did they do this? Let's talk about it. So Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back, was released a little over a year after the first game. And of course, with the massive critical and commercial success of the first game, there were very high hopes for the sequel. As good as the first game was, there was definitely a lot of room for improvement. The controls were a bit flawed, as I previously mentioned, and yeah, the game was just far too hard for casual players. I can remember very clearly playing this game when it first came out, and as far as I was concerned, not only did it live up to the hype and then some, but as far as I was concerned, it pretty much blew the first game out of the water entirely. It took that exact same concept from the first game, and not only made the necessary tweaks to the controls and technicalities, but also drastically improved the level design, adding so much more variety, with levels that had multiple paths to explore, as well as various optional challenges and various ways to approach them. And he even found some more creative and innovative ways to implement the enemies and collectibles into the overall level design. Before I go any further with the review, let me be as blunt as I possibly can here. Crash 2 is, in my personal opinion, not only the best game in the Crash series, but also one of the greatest games of all time. And I say that as someone who recently played through the entire game again in retrospect, achieving 100%, and finding and experiencing everything the game had to offer. In retrospect, I'm actually shocked by how great Crash 2 is. I think this game is an absolute masterpiece and one of the most well-made platformers ever.
Crash? Crash? Crash, my battery is fried. Make yourself useful, big brother, and bring an extra battery for me.
So just like the first game, it's once again a third-person action-adventure platformer. Unlike the first game, which had a story that was basically non-existent throughout most of the game, this game actually has a bit more of a coherent story. It picks up right where the first game left off, with Cortex falling from his airship. Upon landing safely, he discovers a strange crystal. He quickly figures out that these crystals contain a particular type of energy that he can use to power his new giant death laser that he plans to use for world domination. The game then does a time skip to 1 year later. Cortex and his new assistant N-Jin are attempting to find the rest of the crystals, before coming up with the genius plan to intercept Crash and manipulate him into doing their dirty work for them. Crash is just chilling on a beach with his sister Coco, who is a new character introduced in the game, and her laptop runs out of battery power. She asks Crash to go and find her a new battery to power it back up. You get a very short level that helps to familiarise you with the overall controls and gameplay, and one thing you'll likely notice right off the bat is just how much smoother the controls are this time, and how much more refined they feel. The jumping is much more precise this time, the controls are significantly more responsive, and more consistent. The game no longer forces you off a cliff for just trying to jump forward onto a box or a platform. What helps in this regard is that unlike the first game, this one supports analog control, which was of course becoming the standard for PS1 games in the late 90s, since being restricted to the directional buttons for obvious reasons caused many issues with precise jumps as well as sharp turns, and in particularly hard games and fast-paced levels this can cause repetitive strain injuries. But in Crash 2 that isn't an issue, because unlike the first game the controls are practically flawless. In addition to the improvements made to the game's controls, they also added several new moves and attacks, some of which are expertly implemented into the level design. For example, in addition to your classic spin attack, you now also have a ski move. By moving forward and pressing circle, you can skid forward and quickly take out enemies in your path, as well as quickly break boxes and destructible items in the environment. In addition to this, the ski move can also be used to jump considerably higher, and this can of course help you to reach high up areas and platforms, as well as to find hidden areas and collectibles. It helps to make platforming considerably more interesting and more fun. Another new ability added to the game is the belly flop. This allows Crash to slam down on the ground, which can be used to break boxes or defeat certain enemies. It'll also be necessary to break certain boxes, namely the new strong boxes that are immune to your other attacks. As far as I'm aware, the belly flop is the only way to break them. I really like that the developers added new combat moves, and were able to implement them into the platforming and level design. It's something that for obvious reasons makes the game more fun. Once the first level is over, Crash is intercepted against his will by Cortex, who transports him to a warp room, explaining to Crash that he needs to gather 25 crystals in various different worlds in order to prevent some sort of disaster. So yeah, Cortex basically manipulates Crash into thinking he's actually a good guy, and that the events of the first game were just a misunderstanding. Crash, of course being somewhat naive, agrees to do this, and this introduces the game's main formula. There are 5 warp rooms in the game, and these basically replace the islands from the first game. Each warp room contains portals to 5 different levels, each of which will have to be completed in order to progress through the game. Unlike the first game, you can actually choose which order you want to complete levels in. The main goal of each level is to acquire the crystals. There will be 1 crystal per level, and these are usually pretty easy to find, serving as the game's main collectible. They are usually located on the main path somewhere near the end of the level. Trust me, you won't miss them even if you try to. I mentioned earlier that the level design has been significantly improved from the first game. The levels, while still linear, are relatively short and are actually much longer and more complex than the first game, with a few different ways to approach them. Levels will once again be filled with various traps, hazards and obstacles, as well as enemies. Again, you can avoid enemies altogether, or take them out using Crash's spin attack, or jumping on them. You can also use the previously mentioned ski attack to take out certain enemies. In fact, some enemies are immune to regular attacks and can only be defeated using the ski attacks. Some enemies will be immune to all attacks and must simply be avoided. One thing that really surprised me this time is how well placed the enemies in the game are. I had an absolute blast figuring out ways around them, or trying to take them out in style. What you'll notice this time is that despite many of the levels having the same face-forward linear design, with the camera trailing behind Crash just like in the first game, in this game these levels seem to support fast-paced gameplay. It's fun to do speed runs of the levels from time to time, running through them, with the fluid and smooth controls and analog support, as well as the new moves and attacks. It allows you to play the game in a way that just wasn't possible in the first. In the first you would find yourself moving at a snail's pace, just desperately hoping to avoid a cheat death, or hoping that some issue with the game's controls didn't mess you up. In this game you don't have that problem, because the controls and gameplay are just so much more refined, and everything in the game works as it should. Thankfully you can also save the game manually this time from the loading screen in each warp room, so saving your progress isn't much of a problem. Just like in the first game, you have plenty of collectibles here, and these serve pretty much the exact same function. Once again, you can collect Wumpa fruit scattered around the game, Many of these are just lying around, and many of them can be found within breakable boxes. Once again, if you collect 100 of them, then you get an extra life. The game is also much more generous with extra lives, and they aren't always used to bait you into a cheat death. Sometimes they are, but not always. Again, extra lives can also be collected as normal and found in boxes. Once again, you have various kinds of boxes. Normal boxes that will usually contain a single Wumpa fruit for you to pick up. A bouncy box that can be jumped on multiple times to reveal more Wumpas. And even more bouncy boxes that once again help you to reach high up areas and collectibles. You once again also have the metal boxes from the last game that make other boxes appear when you interact with them. Sometimes you will need to backtrack through the levels to collect previously transparent boxes after activating these. You also once again have explosives scattered all over the game. You have the TNTs which can once again be activated by jumping on them, and you have 3 seconds to run away before they explode. And you have the nitros which explode immediately on impact, so be very careful with them. If a level contains nitros, then there will usually be a hidden green metal box that can be interacted with to automatically detonate every single nitro in the level. And this can of course sometimes be necessary for 100% completion, more on that later. You also once again have Aku Aku power-ups that can be collected in levels. These serve the exact same function as they did in the first game, and as far as I can tell they didn't make any changes to them. Be sure to take full advantage of Aku Aku when you can.
What have I got?
And he can even be used to sacrifice a hit point to remove an obstacle if need be. Trust me, if you've played through some of the later levels of this game before, then you probably know exactly what I'm talking about, but I digress. Once again, levels will have bonus areas that can be found on the main path that will transport you to a side-scrolling challenge. Just like in the first game, these will have some tricky platforming challenges, as well as plenty of hazards, obstacles and enemies to avoid, and boxes to break. They're so much better and more interesting this time, and more well designed in my opinion. They usually have the same visual style and aesthetic as the level they're found in. So yeah, long story short, the level design and overall formula of the game is basically a more refined version of what was seen in the first game. What's more interesting this time though, is how the levels feel so much more dynamic, and so much more interconnected. For example, levels will sometimes have alternate routes for you to access. Some levels will have a death route that can be accessed by reaching a particular point in the level without dying once. This can be very tricky in some levels, but it's usually manageable. The death routes will of course contain certain collectibles that would be otherwise inaccessible, such as boxes and extra lives, or even gems, more on those later. Sometimes they can even help you to reach the end of the level quicker and avoid certain obstacles on the main path, though these usually have some challenging obstacles of their own. In addition to the death routes, there are also alternate routes that can be activated by collecting specific coloured gems and using them to access a secret area in another level. Again, more on those later. Some levels will also have hidden secret portals. There is a secret 6th warp room in the game that contains a few interesting curiosities, such as secret levels, as well as alternate routes to some of the main levels in the game, which again can be necessary for completing the game 100%. These secret portals are usually well hidden, but I was able to find them. Just keep an eye out for things that look a bit out of place in a level and you can find them. In addition to levels being more dynamic, there are also so much more variety this time. You have levels that are mostly ground based, with you moving forward and dodging and avoiding enemies and hazards, and engaging in regular platforming. There are also levels where you operate some sort of vehicle or gadget, such as a boat which can be used in some of the stream levels, and even a jetpack. The controls of the jetpack take some getting used to, however. These levels are a blast though. You once again also have levels where the camera angle is switched, and you run away from giant boulders. Making these levels more interesting this time is that instead of a giant boulder, you sometimes run away from a giant polar bear. These levels are terrifying and really challenging. Replacing the warthog riding levels from the first game here, you ride a baby polar bear. These levels are really fast paced and a lot of fun, plus nowhere near as unnecessarily hard as the warthog levels. You even get to ride the polar bear away from the giant one at one point. There are levels where you can hang from grates and climb across them. These can be quite tricky. What's weird is that you can actually pull Crash's legs up and allow certain floating enemies to pass by without damaging you. I didn't realise this for years, and used to spend ages memorising their paths and figuring out the precise hit points to avoid them. There are also some levels which take place in the dark, and you will have to use fireflies to temporarily light up your path. Gee, where have I seen this before? There are even levels where you get attacked by bees and have to hide in the mud to avoid them. So many different and quirky levels that are just so memorable and so fun. So yeah, long story short, the levels of this game are so much more varied and interesting than the first. The game also has plenty of boss battles, and these are much more interesting than the ones in the first game, with the exception of the final boss against Cortex, which is basically just a short chase. You once again take on Ripper Roo, as well as some new enemies such as Tiny the Tiger, the Komodo Bros, and Cortex's sidekick N. Jin in his giant battle mech. Just like the first game, the bosses seem challenging at first, but once you get used to the patterns, they become much easier. I enjoyed the boss battles for the most part, and they help to spice up the game a bit. You can enter each boss battle by travelling between warp rooms and acquiring the necessary crystals. I mentioned before that in addition to crystals, the game also has gems. You once again have the coloured gems and the clear gems. Clear gems serve a much more interesting function this time. Dr. Nitrous Brio, who was Cortex's sidekick in the first game, contacts Crash and asks him to collect all the gems for him, as he needs them for some kind of device that he plans to use against Cortex, with Crash of course agreeing to do this. Just like in the first game, you once again acquire clear gems by breaking every single box in a level. When completing a level, you will get an indicator showing how many boxes you broke, and how many still remain, which helps you to track your progress. You can also view this in the game's HUD. This can usually be done on a first playthrough, but not always. For example, some boxes can only be accessed by first finding a coloured gem and using it to access a secret area, or entering that particular level through a portal in the secret warp room. This of course adds some replay value to the game. Interestingly, some levels will actually have more than one clear gem. In addition to the one acquired by breaking all the boxes, you can also sometimes find one hidden in a level, usually in a secret area. It feels great to explore the game to find these. In addition to the clear gems, you also once again have unique coloured gems. These can be found in specific levels and can either be simply picked up or acquired by completing a unique challenge. I really love the creative and innovative ways that these were hidden in the game. For example, in the first level there's a unique blue gem, but the game doesn't tell you how to acquire it. The only hint that you get, I mentioned before how you have a box counter at the end of each level that will tell you how many boxes you acquired, as opposed to how many you missed. But instead of telling you this, in this particular level, it will tell you how many you broke, out of 0. This is a clever way of indicating to the player that you have to get 0 boxes in the level, play through the level, and avoid breaking any boxes, and you will be rewarded with the blue gem. I can remember figuring this out myself as a kid, and being fascinated by it. You have to remember that this is before the days of the internet being popular, so we had to figure this out by ourselves, using our own brains and our own genuine critical thinking skills. I remember playing through this with my friend as a kid, and coming across the red gem in the level Snow Go. We spent ages trying to jump up and grab it, using every single move or exploit we could. We just couldn't get it. It wasn't until later on that we discovered that you actually have to enter Snow Go from an alternate portal in the secret warp room to enter a higher up area in the level and acquire the gem. This still blows my mind to this day. One of the gems even has you clip through a wall to find it. Again, so cleverly hidden. I really enjoyed finding these, and it helped to make the game so much more intellectually stimulating. I mentioned before these unlock secret hidden areas in the levels that are necessary to complete the level 100%. Speaking of 100%, if you're able to complete the game and find all the collectibles, you once again unlock another ending. Not an alternate ending this time, more so the game's real ending. It's much more worth the time and effort than the first game. Just like the first game, there are a few ways to farm a whole bunch of extra lives that can help you deal with some of the more challenging levels These can be as simple as replaying the early levels to acquire them, or finding secret areas, some of which will be full of them. Oh yeah, this game rewards you for animal abuse. Obviously I'm joking, he's fine. As far as the graphics and presentation go, this couldn't have been better for 1997 in my opinion. This game looks amazing for the time. The character models, backgrounds and environments are incredible, and just like the first game, it has an amazing soundtrack that perfectly suits the tone of each level. Also, some of the failure animations this time are hilarious. I also like how if you're willing to mess about with the game and learn its overall mechanics, it does have several exploits. For example, by using the ski jump you can actually access areas that you weren't supposed to be able to access yet, allowing for some levels to be completed in one go that weren't supposed to be possible. I love it when platformers have stuff like this. It's also fun to replay levels and try to get through them as quickly as possible while taking no damage. It's that kind of addictive game. The voice acting is also considerably better this time, with some pretty funny dialogue. Cortex this time is even voiced by Clancy Brown. Yeah, I didn't realise that for years. So yeah, in case you can't tell, I love Crash 2. I think it's a masterpiece. In my personal opinion, it's where the Crash series peaked. I give Crash 2 a solid and well-deserved 9 out of 10. One of the greatest platformers of all time, and as far as I'm concerned, the best game in the whole series. So with Crash 2 being the best game in the series in my opinion, that pretty much implies that the third game wasn't as good. I want to make it perfectly clear, before I get started with the review, that Crash 2 being my favourite is a personal preference, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the game is objectively better. I just happen to personally prefer it, for my own reasons, and I wanted to make that perfectly clear. Also, I'm sure the reason will become more apparent as I review the third game.
Uka Uka and Cortex plan to use this time-twisting machine to gather crystals that lay scattered across time. I have brought you here to recover the crystals before they do so. To open the time portal, simply stand on a button and then jump into the portal. Good luck.
So after the massive success of the first game, and with the second one taking that exact same concept, and improving and expanding upon it, Naughty Dog of course had every incentive to continue the series and hopefully continue improving. Crash Bandicoot Warped, aka Crash 3, again came out just 1 year after the second game, and attempted to further expand the series. The game released to critical praise and was a massive commercial success just like the previous two, at the time being considered one of the greatest games ever made, and in retrospect many gamers actually do consider it the best in the series. Once again, the game is a third-person action-adventure platformer that pretty much follows the exact same gameplay formula as the previous two games. One thing you'll notice right off the bat is that this is a much more story-driven game than the previous two. The game begins with Uka Uka, the evil brother of Aku Aku, escaping from prison and contacting his minion Cortex, who is of course the main villain of the series. Aku Aku senses this and tasks Crash and his sister Coco with traversing the world to once again find a bunch of crystals in order to prevent Cortex and Uka Uka from getting them. Just like in Crash 2, the game's main hub is a warp room. However, rather than have separate warp rooms this time, you get one main warp room, separated into segments which of course contain levels, known as the time twisting machine. Each of the segments within the time twisting machines will contain 5 buttons, each of which creating a portal for Crash to enter a level. Just like in Crash 2, you can choose to play each level in any order, and can of course return to play them at any time. The main goal of each level, just like in Crash 2, is to acquire a crystal. There will be one crystal in each level, and again these are very easy to find. And of course you have pretty much all the same features and collectibles found in the previous games, such as the breakable boxes of various kinds, as well as the explosives, Wumpa fruits for extra lives, and Aku Aku power-ups for extra hit points, and temporary invisibility. Levels will also be filled with various enemy types, as well as many traps and hazards, and the game doesn't really do anything drastically different from the others in regards to its overall formula and gameplay, which is a good thing in my opinion because it helps to add a certain amount of familiarity to the game. And for fans of the series who like the first two, it's not too steep a learning curve. I like it when sequels keep what works about their predecessors and don't make any unnecessary drastic changes, instead refining, improving and expanding upon what was already there, and adding some new features and innovation, and Crash 3 can certainly lay claim to that. What you may notice very early on, however, is that the difficulty has been drastically toned down from the previous games. In fact, if truth be told, the early levels of the game are incredibly easy. And I'm not just talking about making it to the end and acquiring the crystal, I'm talking about 100%ing the whole levels. I'll talk a bit more about the game's difficulty later in the video. I have a lot to say there. So yeah, you once again traverse the levels, dodging and defeating enemies while avoiding obstacles and hazards in the environment. You also have bonus missions which come with challenges of their own, and once again these are very fun and very interesting. And the game of course once again has plenty of platforming. In addition to the crystals, you of course once again have the gems, and you can find these and unlock them throughout the game. These will once again be necessary for 100% completion, and to unlock one of the game's endings. You have both the cleared gems and the coloured gems. A cleared gem can once again be unlocked by breaking every box within a level. Again, it's usually a lot easier to do in this game than before. In addition to acquiring clear gems this way, you can also find some of them hidden in secret areas of the levels. You also have the death routes, which only appear if you arrive at that point of the level without dying. Some of them will also be in secret areas that can only be accessed after finding the coloured gems. Just like in Crash 2, you find each coloured gem hidden within a particular level, and after finding them you unlock secret routes in other levels. Just like in Crash 2, you will sometimes need to enter a particular level via a secret warp room to acquire some of these. Yeah, did I mention this game also has a secret warp room? This one can simply be accessed by jumping on the platform in the middle of the main hub. And there will be 5 more buttons that activate portals to new levels. Some of these will be locked off to you until you find a certain amount of collectibles. Once again, there are secret portals hidden in certain levels. Some of these are actually quite well hidden. They usually take you to a particular time trial that will contain a clear gem within them. Some of these are actually pretty cool. For example, I got accidentally grabbed by a pterodactyl in one of the dinosaur levels while I was running away from something, and it transported me to a secret time trial where you get to ride a baby dinosaur and jump across platforms. That level was really fun. Hidden challenges and collectibles like this just do their bit to make the game so much more innovative. Interestingly, there are a few new gameplay features that the game has to offer, as well as some new challenges and collectibles, as well as abilities. Namely the new unlockable powers. How it works is that after defeating each of the game's bosses, more on those later, Crash will unlock a new power that will be necessary to complete certain challenges and obtain certain collectibles. For example, you gain the ability to spin while jumping, which allows you to slowly float to a new platform, helping you to make more difficult jumps and time them better. You also gain a more powerful version of the belly flop. This allows you to destroy boxes and explosives from further away. And perhaps the most interesting power-up, the Wumpa launcher. This gives Crash a projectile weapon that allows him to shoot Wumpa fruits at enemies, taking them out in one hit. This can also be used to destroy boxes and explosives from even further away, which is of course very useful. You also gain the ability to run faster. This helps to add some replay value to the game, since several collectibles will be unobtainable without these powers, giving you an incentive to replay levels to find everything. I mentioned before the game has some new collectibles. The main one they added was the relics. Basically how it works is that upon completing a level and obtaining the crystal, you can re-enter the level and right near the beginning you will find a stopwatch. By activating the stopwatch you enter a time trial. These task you with rushing through the level and completing it within a particular time limit. If you manage to do this, you can unlock a relic. This is really fun to do and it can be quite challenging, in some levels more than others. Of course you could ignore this entirely, but if you want to 100% the game, then you will need to get all the collectibles. What was also added this time was a few new level types, as well as a new playable character. In addition to playing as Crash, in some levels you can even play as Coco. Her levels usually involve either riding on her pet tiger Pura. These levels kind of replace the polar levels from Crash 2, and the warthog levels from Crash 1. They're a lot of fun. Or operating a particular vehicle. For example, there are several levels where you get to ride a jet ski on water. Again, those levels are really fun. And you get to fly a plane in some levels and have some aerial combat. Crash has some racing levels where he gets to ride on a motorcycle and race some NPCs. And I guess these foreshadow the legendary Crash Team Racing, which came out the following year I believe. Oh yes, I will be reviewing it at some point, as well as the HD remake which I completed recently, so stay tuned for those. The dinosaur levels even have you running away from a giant triceratops, of course reminiscent of the boulder levels from the first two. There is so much variety in terms of the level design here, and it's just an absolute blast throughout. The game is so fun. I mentioned before that I would talk a bit more about the game's difficulty, because that's something that over the years did get the game a bit of criticism from fans of the first two, who preferred the hardcore difficulty. Me personally, while I do agree that the game starts out very easy, and is nowhere near as hard as the first two, as the game goes on, it does get significantly harder, and the difficulty does increase over time, as it should. It's just that it doesn't bend you over backwards from the beginning, and make you want to rage quit. It slowly but surely introduces you to its overall premise, and how the game is supposed to be played, how its challenges work, and how to overcome them. Then after you've presumably learned enough about the game's mechanics to handle the difficulty, the game's difficulty increases. I think that's how it should be. Yeah, it's not as balanced as the second game, but that doesn't really bother me. It means that the game is more accessible for young players, who might not be too familiar with the series or the platformer genre in general. So yeah, I personally don't have a problem with the game's difficulty. In fact, after playing through Crash 1 and 2, this one felt more leisurely to me. The game of course once again has boss battles, and just like the previous two, the bosses are quite challenging at first. Once you figure out their overall pattern however, they can be pretty easy to defeat. With the Cortex boss being an exception, I still have problems with it to this day. Very challenging boss, way harder than the one in Crash 2. I'd say it's on par with the one in Crash 1, though maybe slightly easier. You have some returning villains to take on, such as Tiny the Tiger, and Cortex's sidekick N-Gin, with a new more powerful battle mech. And you have some new ones such as Dingo Dial, as well as N-Trophy. Again, the bosses are challenging until you figure out what to do against them. The Cortex boss is interesting too because while you fight him, Aku Aku and Uka Uka will fight each other at the same time, meaning you will have to avoid their attacks while fighting Cortex and navigating the area. This was such an awesome idea and I love it. So yeah, boss battles in the game are pretty good, and I have pretty much no criticisms for them. Another pretty interesting feature is that you get a playable demo for Spyro the Dragon, which came out the same year. You get to play the first homeworld, the Artisans, and you get 2 levels. These are Town Square, which for some reason is in the same location as Stone Hills from the main game. And you also get to play the first Speedway. This is such an awesome feature, and it was so interesting and fun to revisit the demo after all these years. It's interesting because I forgot to mention in my Spyro 2 review that that game had a playable demo for Crash Team Racing. I like it when games have those kind of features. So yeah, that pretty much sums up what Crash 3 has to offer, and everything else I could tell you about the game could probably also apply to the first 2, which I already covered in depth. Needless to say, it's a game that I love, but as I previously mentioned, I prefer Crash 2 for some reason. I think it's debatable which is better, but for some reason Crash 2's level design, while not as varied as Crash 3, just seems a bit more interesting to me. I found the unique challenges and collectibles, as well as how the levels were interconnected, to be more impressive in Crash 2, particularly considering the technical limitations of the time. Again, it's debatable which is better, but Crash 2 is my personal favourite. As far as Crash 3 goes, I give it a solid 9 out of 10. A truly great game and one of the best platformers from the 90s. I would recommend any of the 3 original Crash games to anybody who's a fan of PS1 platformers, or platformers in general.
Defeated again! This is not fair! Maybe I should retire to a nice big beach with a nice big drink and a woman with nice big bags of ice for my head.
So yeah, those are the original 3 Crash games. I had an absolute blast replaying them and pondering my thoughts about them back and forth. And I think I basically covered every aspect of them that I wanted to. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I certainly had fun making it. If you did, then please consider hitting the like button, since it really helps the channel. And feel free to subscribe if you want to see more. Providing everything goes to plan, my next video should be a review for Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3. But I haven't completed it yet, so stay tuned for that. And stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.